Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk It Up Tuesdays. Today, we're here with Brian Pfahning, who's one of our staff members at the Turning Point, to talk about reporting sexual assaults. And I think it's going to be a great conversation. But before we get started, I wanted to pull up some information, about the Turning Point. So the Turning Point is based here in Plano, and we serve survivors of sexual violence here in the North Texas area. Our mission is to provide counseling, education, and advocacy for all those impacted by sexual violence. Our crisis hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that number is 1-800-886-7273. Brian, welcome to Talk It Up Tuesdays.
Thank you.
I'm excited to have you here. You bring a really unique perspective to our organization. I wondered if you could begin by just telling us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So currently 24 plus years in law enforcement. I spent almost 20 years full-time for the Plano Police Department. I was on the sexual assault response team with the Turning Point as an investigator. And then I retired from the Plano Police Department and went into nursing. Currently, I am a flight nurse for Air Evac, and then I work for the Turning Point as the sexual assault response team facilitator and a law enforcement trainer in the area of trauma-informed sexual assault response.
So what I think is so wonderful about having your perspective is that you bridge the law enforcement background, the medical. We work so much with collecting forensic evidence and dealing with survivors in these trauma-informed practices. So you kind of bring that holistic perspective, and I think our organization is so much stronger for it. So I hope that most people are aware that as a sexual assault survivor, that you have the right not to report the crime to law enforcement. But I'm hoping that you will shed some light on why it might be a good idea to report sexual assaults to law enforcement. And hopefully, in spite of maybe reservations or hesitations that people might have, you could talk to us a little bit about some of those benefits and maybe things people haven't considered before.
Sure, you are correct. When you are the unfortunate victim of a sexual assault, you have the right not to report to the law enforcement. Now, what that means is it doesn't mean you don't have access to get a sexual assault exam. It just means that you're not reporting the crime to law enforcement. Sexual assault nurses will still do the exam and still collect the necessary things just in case you decide to report later, but it is your right not to report to the police or have that police involvement. That being said, there are a lot of things that come along with reporting that are beneficial. One of the things that happens when you report your crime, then obviously you have the ability to potentially bring that offender before the justice system in order to answer for their crimes. But the other part is that when you report, then it kind of helps start that validation and healing process. So the hope is that when you're able to say that this happened to me to someone else, and then have that person come to you and say, okay, now we're going to step along and we're going to try to help you. The system itself is set up to kind of do that. A lot of the reporting comes along with law enforcement being involved, counseling being involved, prosecutors being involved in those types of things, which can be scary, but ultimately it helps. We found that it helps bring closure in a lot of instances for survivors when they do report.
So I want to clarify real quick. We're speaking about adults ages 18 and up. For anyone that's under 18, it's a requirement that this be reported. It's mandatory reporting, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. If it gets reported or someone finds out about a sexual assault that is under the age of 17, then there are mandatory reports. So if you come to the hospital or you seek medical attention for a sexual assault and they are under that age, then that hospital, medical provider, teacher, those types of things are required to report that because it involves a child.
So we're really talking about adults here. Now, I know that a lot of us have watched the police criminal investigations, SVU, Law and Order, and we have this sense of what the police process might look like. But as I've seen working at Turning Point, and I know probably from your perspective, it's quite different than an hour-long TV show. So I wonder if maybe you can break it down and maybe dispel some of the myths or the common notions that we might have.
Sure. So the basic thing is that when someone comes and accesses the system, they can access the system in many different ways, meaning they can report to multiple different places. So they can show up at the hospital, they can tell a friend, that friend can call the police department. It can happen at school. They can call 911 themselves. There's a lot of different ways in which that report kind of comes to light. After that, then it like you said, we're talking about adults. After that, then the adult themselves decides, yes, I want to make a report. And then the police get involved. So in order for the police to be involved, you have to make a report. And so they will contact that survivor and start the process. It's not the same as what it is. Like the police don't run in and scoop up the offender right away and throw them in jail and then start doing all these interrogations. It's basically what happens is there's a process in which they contact the survivor, find out if there's enough evidence or find out enough information that actually justifies the crime itself, because it could be sexual assault, it could be classified as something else depending on the law. And then they move forward from there. Once that happens, then that person will be offered the SANE exam. That SANE exam will be conducted by a sexual assault nurse examiner, and an advocate is brought out to be with that survivor during that exam, should they choose to have it. Now, you can choose not to have one as well, but obviously, if you're going to go through the trouble or get that courage up to report, then not collecting evidence that could support your crime is probably not a good idea. So that's why we always encourage to report and then also go through the exam. But they'll go through the exam, and then after that, it kind of slows down. It's not super fast. Most studies have shown that because of the brain and the way the brain interacts with trauma, that you need about 48 to 72 hours to kind of consolidate some of that memory post-crime. So a lot of investigators are now being taught not to do a full investigative interview until at least 2 to 3 days after the crime. Now, obviously, if there's a public safety issue, like there's something going on and there's a danger to the public at large, and we need to do all these things, then that happens a little faster. But when it comes to just a general report, hey, this is what happened to me, then it could be up to 2 to 3 days before the detective calls you to, at minimum, before they call you to kind of get that full information. And a lot of that is based on science. We want to make sure we get that information, consolidated in that survivor's brain so that they can give a good statement. And then from there, it kind of slows down even more. They do the investigation, they find out the evidence, and then once the evidence is put together, they will, depending on the case, they will contact the offender. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. It really depends on the case itself. And then it gets sent to the prosecutor, and then from there it goes to trial. It's not an hour process. It could be months process. It could be a year process before it goes from beginning all the way to end. Not being said that it drags out because, people are dragging their feet. That's just the way the process works. So it's just good to know that and have those expectations of, but during that time, places like the Turning Point will be able to offer legal advocacy and advocates and counseling and all of these things during that time that the actual report legal process is following through.
Great. Well, thanks for clarifying that. I know that can be probably, as a survivor, one of the most confusing things, because the justice system, the police, it can all be very vague and not understanding what's going on and where's my role in this. So even that first step of just clarifying, like, you may not have the initial investigation interview, for several days. And that's actually in best practice for the survivor, for the quality of the information that they're collecting. And so I think even that is just a really important point for everyone to know. And then, of course, that longer term process, I think it can be challenging for people not to see things move along at the speed at which we're accustomed to expect from our criminal dramas and just common.
Well,
our
absolutely.
common,
Yeah, absolutely. Because what happens is, so up until about 2 years ago, the average time for DNA to come back was over 3 months. In fact, several years back, it was almost 6 months to a year. Now it's 30 days. So you're looking at, if it's an unknown offender or if it's something that we need DNA to help confirm, it could be 30 days at minimum for that DNA to actually come back, show a profile, and then get that going. So that in and of itself can sometimes be long, and it's long for the investigators too, because we want to get through this process and we want to make it as quick as possible for the survivors. It's just kind of how the system works, because our state lab that does the DNA gets it from everywhere. And so they've gotten it down to 30 days, which is amazing compared to where it was several years ago.
Yeah. So from the survivor's perspective, who all can they expect to maybe interact with on this process from beginning to end, you might say? I assume there are different parties, and I'm just curious what from the legal side.
Yeah, sure. So when you first report, obviously, it's whoever you interact with. So it could be dispatchers, it could be nurses, it could be EMS, fire, police, that type of thing. So a lot of these people that you'll interact with first are going to be that kind of what we call first responder aspect. And then from there, you make the report. You will typically talk to a reporting officer or a patrol officer that will come out, take the report. Depending on the facts of the case and the evidence, generally, like I said, best practices are going to be that the investigator is called that night, but may not call that survivor in for a couple of days to get the full investigative interview. But the investigator will be behind the scenes doing a lot of things because that's their case at that point. So they may or may not get contacted immediately by an investigator. If they are, it's going to be generally, hey, this is who I am. I've got the facts, and then I'm going to call you back in later. They will talk to generally a SANE nurse. The Turning Point sends out advocates, so you'll have an advocate with you to sit and kind of hold space and help you, guide you through the process. And that's kind of at the initial stage. Once it goes from that initial stage, then you will continue to talk to the investigator assigned to the case. Hopefully at that point, you will be given access to counseling and taking advantage of that access to counseling. So you could be talking to counselors at that point, kind of while the case is being processed. At some point during the process, you may or may not get contacted by the prosecutor. If the case is going to go to trial, then the prosecutor generally meets with the survivor to kind of go over that process, kind of demystify, tell them kind of what the process is going to be like, and kind of get them used to, these are some of the questions you're going to be asked. And then from there, they kind of go to trial. So there's a bunch of different people that are kind of involved, but it's all kind of through the process. Now, during this process, if you need to have someone there to help kind of be there with you, you can. During an investigative interview for law enforcement, you can have an advocate there for that initial investigative interview. You can have an advocate there to kind of go and do a legal accompaniment with you. If you are scared about going to court, then they can kind of help you with that. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to have people there to support that survivor throughout the process.
So at the Turning Point, that's one of the services we provide is legal advocacy. And I think it's important to note that we're not affiliated with law enforcement. We work closely together with them in partnerships to help find the best solution to pursue justice. You know, we're trying to all work together, but we're not affiliated with law enforcement. And our focus as advocates, as legal advocates, is really there with the sole intention of supporting the survivor, of being a neutral source for information, for referral, to just kind of be with that survivor.
Right. And that's the whole idea, is that you have someone there that's supporting the survivor, that sole interest and sole mission is to advocate for that survivor and help them through the process. And that's why it's so beneficial to have that. And because the law enforcement will have to do their job and they will have to do certain things that may or may not be, you know, in a way, they may not seem very warm and fuzzy, but that's because of the way the system works. So it's nice to have that advocate and that person there to help kind of guide that survivor through the process, and kind of help hold what I call hold space, you know, just kind of be there, even if it's just to sit there with them, then that can mean a lot.
Yeah. So I think in our common culture, a lot of times we think of the final product as being justice. So if the person who committed the assault is found guilty, justice has been served. Or if the person who committed the assault is found innocent, like either, you know, then it invalidates everything that anyone has experienced. And that's a really, really like almost a lie that kind of can live within survivors that we see when they're pursuing this reporting route. But it's really, I think it can be harmful and misaligned to pin everything on sort of the judicial outcome because of the way that the system is structured. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and we'll go for that first example. So let's say you have an offender that goes all the way through the court and that gets convicted. Okay, so they're convicted and they're put in jail. But what does that truly do? Does it change what happened to the survivor at the initial part? If they haven't had that support through the process and they haven't had the validation and they haven't kind of worked for, you know, the betterment of them, then does that really do anything for them? It just basically puts somebody in jail. And while some people might consider that justice for the survivor, that may not be the full closure. And so the opposite is true as well. Even if you go through the process, you report, you do these things, if you have that support and you are continually supported throughout the process, you've got the validation, you're working towards kind of being better from where you were, then it doesn't really matter what happens in the legal outcome. Yes, we all want to. I guarantee you that the investigators want to put those offenders in jail. But if you look at it more of a holistic way and you look at it more from the survivor's standpoint, and support and validation from the very beginning, then it really doesn't matter at the end what that is. And if you put a lot of your, basically you put a lot of your healing, well, I'm not going to be healed until it's found guilty, then that's kind of a misnomer because it may or may not. The legal system can't be counted on to make things better for the survivor. And so really the idea is, and what a lot of law enforcement agencies and this whole idea of trauma-informed sexual assault response is that we start from the very beginning and we move through the process. And no matter what the outcome is, the idea is that we help that survivor not make this the sticking point that makes things worse for the rest of their life. It becomes hopefully a thing that was very tragic that happened, but they're able to create a better outcome and be stronger and better afterwards. And that really, truly has nothing to do with the legal system. It really has to do with everyone in the whole process. All those people I talked about, the prosecutors, the law enforcement, the investigators, the advocates, all working with the victim to create an environment in which they can grow out of this and kind of move forward and be better than they were when they came in.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that so you can see kind of the emphasis on survivor and healing and growth and kind of separate that from the legal aspects. I ran across this survey that was done, and I know that similar ones have been done in the US. This one was done in the United Kingdom, and it really talked to survivors, and it said, hey, as a survivor who's gone through this recently or maybe at a longer term, what does justice mean for you? And in some things that they said, ability for the perpetrator and consequences, but what those consequences meant might vary from person to person. Some of it was violence prevention, like knowing that this individual who committed this offense against me won't hurt somebody else. Some of it was just that validation and recognition that I was hurt and harmed. Another was being able to have that voice to say, like, this is what happened to me. This is my story, and have that to be seen. And then I think there were two others. One was just being treated with dignity. And that's kind of falls into that where you were saying everybody in the system sees you as a person, recognizes you and treats you with that dignity carried throughout the system. And the last part is it refers to it as citizenship as justice, but I think that's what recognizes that survivors may need material support, may need that counseling, may need that that intervention to help reintegrate back into, after an assault, you feel maybe isolated or cut off from community. And so that is really helping to strengthen and reintegrate back into society as a whole. So I don't know if any of those really resonate with you and kind of what you've seen and your experience, but maybe you could say a few words about if you have anything to add on that.
Sure. No, that's all true. The biggest thing that we've seen in the studies that we've done here, and the things that when we teach law enforcement about trauma-informed, one of the biggest things that we've found is a survivor's healing and a survivor's ability to kind of grow out of this. And what I mean by that is just kind of hopefully move past it at some point to the level that they can. A lot of that depends on their support and validation. And so it doesn't, nowhere in there does it say guilty or innocent. It says support and validation for the person as a human being through the process, and that dignity and the idea of hearing them and seeing them. It really, none of the studies show that it has to be a guilty or it has to be an innocent or someone has to go to jail. It's really about that survivor and how they were treated through the process. And so that's kind of one of the things that has kind of switched for law enforcement over the last several years is like, yeah, we want to put the bad guys in jail, but in particular, when it comes to sexual assault and sexual assault survivors, we want to make sure that they feel supported and validated from that moment that we contact them. I'm sorry that this happened to you. Let's see what we can do for you to help get you to a point where you can feel better. And that involves all of those other things that you talked about, the reintegration, the counseling, and all of those things.
Great. Well, Brian, I think that covers all the questions that I have for this topic. If you have anything to add or anything that we use resources or anything that you want to share that you can make to SAO.
Yeah, so the thing that I just want to say is that, we hear you, we see you, especially from a law enforcement perspective, and that don't be afraid to report. If you feel like you need some support before you report, then contact someone, get somebody to be there with you. The Turning Point can have an advocate there and they can help walk you with the process and just sit right there next to you when you do that. But report these things because we want to be able to access those and we want to be able to be there for you. And then, if you have any questions locally about what the reporting process looks like, then you can always contact your local law enforcement. Most of the agencies have a crime victims liaison. You can talk to the crime victims liaison and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What's the process? And then they can help kind of integrate you into the system that's local to you.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for spending a Tuesday afternoon and sharing a little bit about this. I look forward to talking to you again and your expertise and all this is always incredible. It's a resource for our community. So we appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Take care. And we'll be back here next Tuesday.